there, Sandra here from Createinspain, and this video is for my friend Alison. She wanted me to show her how to use the gouache paints that she has bought since I recommended them. Now, when I bought these gouache paints, the reason I bought them was so that it could be used instead of ink pads, and they do that brilliantly. But she also wanted to see how to actually kind of watercolour with them. You don't usually use the term I gouache paint, do you? You say I watercolour. Anyway, gouache are very similar to watercolour in that they are water activated. They stay water activated even after they've dried. I've got a set of 60 Arteza ones which I bought, and I've got such a wonderful array of colours, it's brilliant. And I've just done a little doodle here. This is not meant to be anything particularly, it's obviously botanical of some description, but it's fantasy. It's not actually a real thing. I've got a tile here, just a plain white ceramic tile, because it's a nice easy surface to clean when I put paint on it. I have a very stained piece of toweling to one side, and I also have a piece of artificial chamois, so I can wipe my brush on that if I want to. And I have some water brushes. Now, these happen to be a set that I got in Lidl, probably about 6 months, 9 months ago, something like that. I've got some Pentel ones as well, and I've also got some which come with the watercolor brush set that I purchased, which is by Createinspain. And I showed Alison a couple of pictures of some Createinspain watercolour that I had done, and she thought it was really nice and wanted to know how to do it. Now, my example was actually done on watercolour paper. This is not watercolour paper, this is just a relatively cheap card, no particular brand. And I don't know how well it's going to take to this, but I just thought I'd try and see, you know, no harm, no foul. And this colour is ice blue, which is almost a silver. It is so pale, but it's a gorgeous colour. And I'm just going to put a tiny little bit of paint on my tile, as you see there. And what I'm going to do, first of all, I have a brush which is flowing quite nicely. It's got quite a lot of water on it. And so I'm just going to put some water around this design, relatively loosely, I hasten to add. And then I'm just going to drop in just a little bit of colour. Now, I don't want a really, really solid, harsh colour. So what I can do is dry off my brush very slightly, and at the edges just dampen it a little bit. Now, you can barely see that colour because it is a very, very, very pale colour. But you can do it with whatever colour you like. I might swap to a darker colour simply so that you can see it, because I can see it but you probably can't, which is unfortunate. But it is the colour that I wanted it to be. So yeah, there we go. And I'm not really soaking the brush in the paint, I'm just dipping it in the paint. And then putting it into the slightly dampened card. Now, obviously, the less dilute you make this, the stronger your colour will be. But I think I better put a stronger colour down there. You can't see this, obviously. So I'm going to put another type of blue. Let's see what this one's like. Okay. I'll probably mix the two of them together because that's a bit darker than I wanted to go. But there we are. I'm going to dampen my brush again, because I don't want this to be really, really dark, so I've diluted it somewhat. Just put that in there. And all I'm doing is really sort of scrubbing it around. I'm not going for sort of, you know, really close to the lines type thing. That's really not what I want to do. I just want a vague indication of colour in the background. Dry my brush off slightly and just tail off the colour towards the edge. And you can see it looks very, very similar to watercolour, but it is definitely more opaque. Watercolour will be transparent pretty much as soon as you dilute it. This, you need a little more liquid to make it that transparent. But you can, of course, mix it up. Say, put some here on my palette, mix it up, really dilute it, dry your brush off, and then go in if you want to do it that way. Sorry about that. My phone's got a message for me. So this is what it would look like if you just put it down and you didn't put it on a wet surface. You get harsh lines, all right? But again, you can dip your brush in water, dry it off a bit, and then you can pull this out, and you're going to gradually get less and less colour on the edges, so you can do a variegated wash with it. It's not going to be a solid block of colour unless you want it to be. And if you want it to be, that's great. So I'm just going to continue with this. Just add a bit more colour. I'm going to go back for my silver, but put a tiny bit of blue in it. I say silver, it's an ice blue. It's not actually supposed to be silver. There is a silver paint in this set, but that's not it. There we are. And come back in here. Put a little bit of paint in that loop because otherwise it'll look very strange with nothing in it. Get the paint off my brush, dry my brush a little. And there we go. This is one of the reasons why I think, particularly for beginners, this sort of brush, a water brush, is really, really good. If you're just using it straight, you want to actually colour something which has got definite edges, and you want a straightforward colour. This will do it so very, very easily. It's just like using the watercolour brushes that are pre-made for you. It's just that you don't have it, sorry, don't have it within the actual brush. And you need a bit of a palette to use it. But it's not difficult. But these sorts of brushes are great because the actual fibres are quite forgiving. They're not expensive brushes for a start. But they kind of self-clean as you're using them. So whereas with other brushes, the paint goes up into the bristles and, you know, can sometimes go further up than you might want. With this, because there's water constantly coming out of it, it kind of self-cleans while you're using, which is nice. Doesn't take much effort to change colour either. So I'm going to come down here with a damp brush with no paint on it. And I'm going to put some of the very, very pale blue, the ice blue, in here. Need to dilute that a little bit, I have too much paint on there. There we go. A bit more of the other blue. Now what you will find if you're not using watercolour paper and you put too much water on it, you're just going to find it's going to wrinkle up. It's not much fun to work with if it does that. And yeah, it just makes life a little more difficult for you. But as you can see from this, you know, it's not doing too badly, and this is just a cheapo card, all right? Now I've pretty much finished, I think, with those colours. Now, if I was using a watercolour paper, I would probably keep going. I'm just going to let this dry for a little while, I think, before I do any more. Just got a blotch of paint there. Now, the other thing is, which I've just done, you can, with this kind of paper, end up with some pilling. You've got to be very careful not to overbrush it. I've just about got away with that. Whereas watercolour paper is far more forgiving of that. You've really got to work it a bit more to get a problem with actual watercolour paper. Now, the other reason for leaving this to dry is because if you're, for example, going to paint the berries and this is wet and your berry paint might be, I don't know, deep purple or something, it's going to seep into anything wet around it. So you need to make sure that areas which are adjacent, I'll just flick some water on there, areas which are adjacent are going to be dry. Otherwise, it will bleed. 9 times out of 10, that is something that you want it to do because you don't want harsh edges, you want to work wet on wet, whatever. But if you're actually intending to colour these pieces in and you don't want a great smudge of paint, then you need to let it dry first. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm just going to come back later. I've allowed this to dry, and although it's curled up at the edges, it's otherwise fine. Now, for the greenery here, I want to use an olive green. Now, the reason I use an olive green as opposed to other colours, it's not really dark, not really light, but it isn't a bright, garish green. Green is a difficult one. Probably got way too much paint there, actually. But green is a difficult one because if you use a sort of a bright green, it can really look odd. Really, really odd. So I tend not to try and do that. So I'm swapping over to a small brush because these are relatively fine lines. And I'm just going to take a little bit of the paint on my brush to use it. And just basically fill in the lined area. Now, if you want to, you can use the same technique as we used for going around these plants. You can put water in here and then you can add your paint afterwards. So if I take the paint off of there and do this bit here so that it just has water, and then put the paint into it, it would flow in the same way that a normal watercolour will. So, you know, it's up to you, whichever way you want to do it. Just don't overdo the water. And when it comes to the greenery and tendrils and things, try and stay within the lines. And then you'll be fine. So this gives an impression of greenery, but it's not bright, it's not garish, but it's not really dark either. So I think olive green is definitely one of my preferred colours for this. If you want to, you can add other colours to it. You could add tinges of yellow for a brighter area, or you could add a slightly darker green or darker blue to it if you want to make it darker. So I'm just going to do these little bits here. Bear in mind, when you're painting, you don't have to keep your painting in the same direction. You know, if you're left-handed, you can turn it one way. You're right-handed, you can turn it another. There's no right and wrong way. Anything that makes it easier for you, because it's always easier to paint or to draw in one direction or the other for everybody, pretty much. It just depends on the way your brain is wired as to which way you find it easier to get the most control. Now, when you're doing something like this, which is fairly fine, control is definitely the name of the game. So I'm not adding an awful lot of water to this bit because I don't want to flood these fine bits. And I might go in afterwards with some other shades, but this will do fine for the basic bit. Now you can see I've got dried paint on my palette, as with a normal watercolour. If I want to reactivate it, I can just add water to it and that will do the job, no problem at all. So now that I've done that, I'm going to go in and do some leaves. And this time I'm going to do a wet leaf and just drop some paint in. I'm going to need a bit paler. Still sticking with very small brush because these are relatively small areas, and it's much easier to do a tidy job with painting these when you don't have an oversized brush. I mean, there's very little worse in painting than trying to use the wrong size brush. If you're doing a big wash, you want a big brush. Don't do it with a little one. If you're doing a little detail, then go for a smaller brush. Don't try doing it with a large one. And these brushes aren't expensive to get. You can get a set of about half a dozen for about £10 or probably about $10 or something. It's not going to break the bank. And they'll last a long time because they're quite difficult brushes to wreck. I think that's all my leaves. Oh no, it isn't. Oh, silly me. Silly, silly me. Right. As it happens, I freehand drew this little drawing. You can use stamps, no problem. Just make sure you have an ink which is waterproof if you're stamping. Otherwise you'll just get a rather grey looking picture at the end of the day, and that's probably not what you're after. And I really did put way too much paint on there. It sort of came out a bit fast. As you can tell, doing this on card fronts is very economical because you use hardly any paint at all. Now, if I wanted to, if I was really, really bothered, I would just keep that paint on my tile and use it another time when I was doing some more painting. I'm probably not going to do that, but I could if I needed to or wanted to. So I need to pick a colour now for the flowers that I have there. And I'm going to go for a blush pink, I think. Yeah, that'll do nicely. So I'm just going to wash this brush off onto my damp cloth. I'm not even going to bother to put paint on my tile for this. I've only got 2 flowers, so all I'm going to do is put a little water on my petals, and then I will just dip it into the top of the paint tube and put some paint in there. Too much more water, I think. There we go, a little variety of colour, and the same for this one. Make sure it's wet. As you can make this one paler again by adding some more water to it on top, and just drop it in. we are. So I'm going to go with this one, which is Wineberry. I'm literally just going to touch it to the tile. Just get a tiniest amount of paint out of there. Take some of that and moisten it. This is just the first coat. I can go in that way and go in with some more darker colours afterwards. My hands of the Baskervilles are at it again. Touch of water just to make this easier to brush on. And I can come over to these, make another second layer of paint as well. Even if I didn't make the paint more concentrated, just adding a second layer of colour over the top of these would have a darkening effect. There we go. And I'm going to make this a much looser wash and put some darker pink in that part of the flower there, and this central part of the flower here. It ties in the colours together, just makes everything a bit more cohesive. There we go. So a very easy little sketchy thing to do for a card front. Now I did make it bigger than I would need for the card, so I can trim this down and just take the bits that I want. And if I wanted to, I could come in with more washes to vary the colour around the greenery here. This is quite a nice delicate feel though, and I quite like that one. I think by the time I've actually got a sentiment and put it onto a coloured card base, I think that will work quite nicely. But I can also go in with my green again if I want to. Don't have to, but you can. And add some shading to that as well. So that it's not all exactly the same colour. So you can vary the colour that you go over the second time. You know, you could make it slightly more yellow, or you could make it darker. Yeah, it's just a case of what you feel like doing with it. Yeah, it's fine. Whatever you do doesn't really make too much difference. It's your picture. You do what you want to do with it. I'm going to put some darker green on the lower portion of the stalk. And do a bit of darker green just up here, I think. And there we go, I'm done. So that's all finished and I can get my card base ready. So now my card front is put onto the card base. I've just gone for a movie base on this one. I've not done a sentiment, as is my habit, because I don't know what I'm going to send it for. And I have a couple of pens here which I'm going to finish this off with. These are Stardust Jelly Roll pens by Sakura. This one is colourless and this one is a pale blue. So I'm just going to put some little dots around, and I just think it adds something. I don't know why it does, it just does. So some little blue dots like that. And the colourless one, I'm actually going to use that to go over my flowers and give them a bit of a glittery shine. It's very subtle, you won't notice it at first. It's only when you see it in certain lights that you'll actually get to see that shine coming up. And because this is a colourless one, it literally adds just the glitter rather than changing the colour at all. And I'm going to put a bit of it on my berries as well. Why not? Go the whole hog. There we go. Card finished. So that's how to actually use the gouache paints for painting. If you're not particularly artistic, it is still quite easy to do. You can always use a stamped image if you don't want to actually draw something yourself. Take care now. Bye bye.